The end of the war, the great war that had consumed half the galaxy, was said to be over, and in the grand chambers of the alien capital, a celebration was prepared. The coalition of alien species had fought together for many long years against the humans and their stubborn resistance. Worlds had burned and fleets had vanished in the darkness of space, but at last the alien coalition believed the final blow had been struck. Reports carried by scouts told of human colonies reduced to silence, of shattered fleets drifting like bones in orbit, and of soldiers who no longer answered their command posts. The coalition leaders gathered in their towering hall to declare the end of the war and the triumph of their alliance. The chamber itself was a massive circle of polished stone and glowing crystal. Rows upon rows of alien dignitaries filled the seats, their voices blending into a low hum of victory. Banners of every coalition world hung from the walls, their colors shimmering under the bright lights. Outside, in the vast city, millions of citizens filled the streets, chanting songs of triumph, releasing lights into the sky, and speaking of how the human menace was at last broken. For them it was a day of relief after endless years of fear. And lost in the center of the chamber stood the high platform where the council would soon announce the final declaration of victory. Many alien commanders were present, their armor polished, their medals heavy upon their chests. They looked proud but also weary, for they had seen how long the humans had resisted and how costly every step of this war had been. Yet they told themselves the cost did not matter now, for the enemy was gone and the galaxy could breathe again. But beneath this atmosphere of joy, there was an unease that no one wished to speak aloud. Too many commanders remembered the human way of fighting. They remembered battles where fleets that should have been crushed had returned again and again, their ships patched with metal torn from wrecks, their weapons firing even when logic said they should have been silent. They remembered soldiers who kept advancing when wounds should have brought them to the ground. They remembered civilians who took up arms and refused to bow even when all hope was gone. Such memories did not sit well with the idea of human defeat, yet none wished to cloud the ceremony with doubt. The official record was clear. Humanity was broken. Their fleets no longer stood in formation across the stars. Their homeworld was scarred and silent. Their allies had abandoned them. By every measure the humans had lost and the coalition had won. And so the ceremony continued. The council announced the new age of peace. A chorus of voices filled the chamber. Delegates rose to speak of rebuilding the galaxy. Plans were made for the division of former human territories. Some spoke of turning human colonies into outposts, and others spoke of cleansing the remaining survivors to prevent any future resistance. In the eyes of most, humanity had no place left in the future that was being shaped here, and yet one figure stood apart from the joy. A diplomat who had studied humanity more closely than any of the others waited in silence. This diplomat had lived among humans in the early days before war had torn the stars apart. They had walked in human cities, spoken with human soldiers, and seen how their minds worked when pressed by danger. Unlike the generals and admirals who had measured human strength in ships and numbers, this diplomat had measured something deeper, something invisible yet more frightening than any fleet. As the ceremony went on, the diplomat's eyes moved across the chamber. They saw the proud commanders and the triumphant envoys, but in their hearts, they felt only the weight of a warning that no one seemed ready to hear. For they had seen how humans did not surrender even when they had nothing left. They had seen how defeat for humans was never an ending but a beginning of something harder, sharper, and far more dangerous. When the High Council called for speeches, one after another the voices of alien leaders filled the chamber. They spoke of honor and sacrifice, of the end of war, of the dawn of peace. The crowd answered with cheers. Outside the city roared with celebration. Yet still the diplomat remained silent, waiting for their moment. They knew that when their time came, the mood of the chamber would change. The words they carried were not those of triumph, but of a truth the coalition did not want to face. Finally, their name was called. The crowd quieted and turned toward the platform. The diplomats stepped forward slowly, their robes brushing against the floor, their eyes steady and unblinking. They stood at the edge of the platform and for a moment looked at the banners of the coalition that swayed above. Then their gaze dropped to the crowd of commanders, governors, and envoys who expected to hear words of praise and unity. The silence stretched across the hall. The diplomat's voice rose, calm but heavy with meaning. They began not with celebration but with memory. They reminded the council of the first time the coalition fleets had clashed with humans. How the coalition had believed the war would be quick. How the humans had been outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded. And yet the humans had not yielded. The diplomats spoke of battles where human ships had fought until they were only fire and wreckage. They spoke of worlds where entire populations had resisted, not for victory, but simply to deny the enemy the taste of conquest. The chamber grew quiet as the diplomat spoke. The cheers and joy drained away and were replaced with a heavy stillness. The diplomat's voice carried through the hall like a warning bell. They asked the commanders why, if humanity was so weak, the war had lasted so long. They asked why every fleet had returned from human space with scars so deep and losses so heavy. They asked why even in victory, the coalition had never once seen a human truly beg for mercy. And as the diplomat's words spread across the chamber, many of the commanders who had fought humans began to lower their eyes. They remembered. They remembered too well. The diplomat paused, their voice steady. And then they said that the war was not over. Humanity was not broken. The humans had simply stepped back. They had given silence where before there had been defiance. And that silence was not surrender. It was only the breath before the next strike. The crowd shifted uneasily. The celebration felt thin now, almost hollow. Outside the city still roared with victory songs, but inside the chamber there was only the diplomat's voice and the weight of memory pressing on every heart. The diplomat did not yet speak the words that would shatter the illusion of victory completely. That moment would come soon. But already the seed of fear was planted, and the coalition leaders understood, though they did not yet admit it, that the story of humanity was not finished. The chamber had been filled with the sound of triumph, but now it was filled with silence. And in that silence, the memory of human defiance grew larger than any victory banner. The shadows of doubt, the celebration in the alien capital, did not end with the first speeches. The city streets still thundered with voices, music, and banners that lit the skies like rivers of fire. But inside the great chamber, where the real power of the coalition sat, the mood had begun to change. The diplomat's words lingered in the minds of many, and though the council tried to continue with their proud declarations, whispers began to spread through the rows of seats. The alien commanders and envoys who had fought close against humanity found themselves uneasy, and they wondered if their triumph had truly been as final as they wished to believe. One commander leaned close to another and spoke in a low tone, his voice trembling despite his decorated armor. He said he remembered a battle where his fleet had cornered a human squadron near a red dwarf star. The humans had been cut off, their supplies gone, their ships broken and battered. By every measure, they should have surrendered. Instead, they had launched themselves into a fight so furious that half his fleet had been torn apart before the humans finally fell silent. He whispered that he could still see their ships burning and still hear the cries of their last attack. His fellow commander said nothing, but his hands clenched around the edge of his seat as if the memory, too, had risen in his mind. Another envoy told of a human colony that had been declared conquered after the coalition armies landed in force. The city had been shattered, its defenses gone. Yet for weeks afterward, resistance had erupted from the shadows of the ruins. Civilians had turned their homes into traps, Workers had turned mining equipment into weapons, and children had carried messages through tunnels to fighters who refused to give up. The envoy said he had watched soldiers grow afraid to patrol the streets, not because of any great army, but because the humans fought with a will that could not be broken. Even when their families starved, they still stood, and even when captured, they spat words of defiance until the very end. These stories were not told aloud to the chamber, but in whispers between seats and in quiet corners after the speeches. Yet they spread quickly. It was impossible not to remember. Every commander had his own story of humans who should have surrendered but did not. Every envoy had seen a colony that should have fallen silent but kept rising again. And though the council leaders tried to press forward with plans for dividing human space, the shadows of doubt crept through their words like cracks in stone. The diplomat who had spoken earlier watched this unfold in silence. They saw the change ripple through the chamber. They saw the once proud commanders avoiding each other's eyes, and they knew the truth was already beginning to bloom, even without their final warning. For the diplomat understood that the coalition had never truly defeated the humans. They had only survived them. As the day turned to night, the celebration continued outside, but inside the halls of power, a tension grew heavier. The coalition leaders tried to drown the unease with more speeches of triumph. They spoke of new trade routes, of colonies to be rebuilt, of resources to be shared. But their words felt thin, as if no one truly believed them. Some of the younger delegates, who had never faced humans directly, dismissed the fears as old soldier tales. They said humans had only seemed strong because they were desperate. They said now that their fleets were broken, they could never rise again. But the older commanders only shook their heads. They knew what they had seen. They had seen humans make weapons out of scrap metal and fuel lines. They had seen soldiers charge into fire knowing they would not survive, only to give their comrades one more chance. They had seen humans laugh in the face of death, as if death itself could not chain them. And in the silence between the speeches, the commanders wondered, why had the humans fought so long when logic demanded surrender? Why had they kept going when every other species would have yielded? The more they asked themselves these questions, the more uneasy they grew, because no one had an answer that satisfied. Late that night, when the council adjourned and the banners were lowered, groups of officers gathered in private rooms to speak. They asked each other why the humans had fallen so silent at the end of the war. They asked why the last human fleet had not been hunted down, but instead had simply vanished into the void, its path unknown. Some whispered that perhaps the humans were rebuilding somewhere in the darkness. Some said perhaps they were watching, waiting for the day they would strike again. The younger ones laughed at this, but the veterans did not laugh. Their eyes carried the memory of too many battles, and their silence was heavier than words. Meanwhile, across the city, reports filtered in from outlying colonies. Some outposts reported strange disappearances. A convoy claimed it had been shadowed by unknown ships that vanished when approached. Patrols spoke of signals in the dark, signals that matched human codes, though faint and broken. These reports were dismissed officially as errors or malfunctions, yet the officers who brought them knew better. They knew the humans were not gone. They were out there. They always were. The diplomat walked alone through the silent halls after the council dispersed. They thought of the humans they had once known, the families who had invited them into their homes before the war, the soldiers who had spoken with pride about their history. They remembered how those humans had said that when pressed hardest, when the world seemed darkest, that was when humanity found its true strength. The diplomat knew those words were not empty. They had seen them come alive in the war. And now they saw that same truth waiting in the silence. By the time dawn returned to the capital, the celebration still filled the streets, but the chamber of leaders no longer shone with the same triumph. Doubt had spread like smoke. It was not spoken in the open, but it was there in every glance, every whisper, every memory that could not be silenced. The coalition believed it had won. Yet in the hearts of those who had faced humanity, a question grew stronger with each passing hour. Had they truly defeated the humans? Or had the humans only allowed them this fragile moment of peace? The answer was not yet spoken aloud. But already the shadows of doubt had begun to turn victory into fear. The revelation the next day, the council hall was filled once again. The banners were still raised and the music of triumph still echoed faintly through the streets. But the mood inside was heavy. Many of the commanders had not slept. Their dreams had been filled with visions of burning skies and endless battles where human voices still roared defiantly. They arrived at the chamber with tired eyes and restless hearts. Some tried to push away their memories by repeating the words of victory that had been spoken the day before, but those words no longer felt solid. They felt thin like paper that could be torn apart with a single breath. The diplomat stood quietly at the edge of the hall, watching. They could see the unrest growing in the faces of the leaders and the soldiers. The diplomat knew that the time for soft hints had passed. If the coalition believed that the humans were finished, they would make choices that could doom them all. And so when the call for speeches came, the diplomat stepped forward once again. The voices in the chamber fell silent. Every eye turned toward the robed figure on the high platform. The diplomat's steps echoed against the stone floor, and the weight of their presence seemed to press against the chamber walls. They lifted their gaze, steady and calm, and began to speak in a voice that carried to every corner. They reminded the council of the long years of war, not with pride, but with truth. They spoke of how the coalition had believed from the beginning that victory would be swift, because humanity was young compared to the ancient powers of the stars. They spoke of how the coalition had mocked the small fleets of humanity, the fragile colonies, the lack of advanced technology. By every calculation, humans should have fallen in months. And yet the war had dragged on year after year until the galaxy itself had begun to groan under its weight. The diplomat's words painted pictures that returned in the minds of all who listened. They spoke of battles where human fleets appeared broken and scattered, yet returned again and again stronger than before. They told of soldiers who fought even when fire consumed their bodies, who pressed forward even when their leaders had fallen. They told of civilians who took the weapons of the dead and stood shoulder to shoulder against armies that should have crushed them. As the diplomat spoke, the chamber grew so still that the hum of the city outside seemed distant and unreal. The commanders remembered these things, though they had buried the memories deep. The envoys recalled seeing human prisoners who refused to bow their heads. Even chained, even beaten, their eyes had carried a fire that no other species had shown. Diplomat's voice rose and carried like a storm. They said the coalition had not defeated humanity in truth. For what does it mean to defeat a people who do not know surrender? The diplomat asked the council how many times they had declared victory before, only to find human resistance still alive. How many times they had thought a world was pacified, only for fire to rise again from the ashes. The silence of the hall deepened. Some of the younger delegates shifted uncomfortably, trying to hold on to the dream of victory. But the older ones did not move, for they knew these words were not lies. The diplomat then spoke of something greater than battles and fleets. They spoke of what made humanity different from every other race the coalition had faced. They said humans carried a spirit that thrived on struggle. While others broke under the weight of endless war, humans grew stronger within it. While others sought safety, humans sought challenge. Where others prayed for peace, humans prepared for the next fight. The diplomat said that in the darkest of times, when defeat seemed certain, humans changed. They adapted, they endured, and they transformed despair into a weapon sharper than any blade. The diplomat's voice shook with force as they spoke. the words that would be remembered long after the banners of the coalition had rotted away. They said that in every war there were strong fighters, but in humanity there was something more. They said humanity were not simply soldiers or survivors. They were something the galaxy had no word for. And then the diplomat gave them a name that sent a chill through every heart in the chamber. They said, "Humans are the gods of war." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. No one moved, no one spoke. Even the younger delegates who had laughed at the stories the night before now felt the weight of those words pressing upon them. For deep inside they all knew it was true. They had all seen it in some form. They had all heard the stories from soldiers who returned haunted from the front. They had all felt the fear that grew whenever humans refused to die quietly. The diplomat continued, their voice softer now but sharper still. They said that the coalition's so-called victory was an illusion. The humans had not been destroyed. They had not surrendered. They had only paused. They had stepped back into silence, but silence for humans was not the end. It was the waiting breath before the storm. The council chamber felt colder than stone as the diplomat's words sank in. Commanders glanced at one another, and for the first time since the war began, none of them felt triumphant. They felt only the memory of human defiance, growing larger the more they tried to deny it. One by one, the faces of the leaders changed from pride to unease, from unease to fear. They had gathered to celebrate the final end of war, but instead they found themselves staring into the shadow of a future where war might return fiercer than ever. The diplomat looked over the chamber one last time. Their gaze swept across the banners, the medals, the bright lights, and the proud but trembling leaders. And then they spoke one final line for the day. They said that the coalition should not ask whether they had defeated the humans. They should ask only how long it would be before the humans returned, and whether they themselves would survive when the gods of war rose once more. The chamber stayed silent long after the diplomat stepped down. The weight of those words pressed against every heart, and for the first time since the war's end, the leaders of the coalition were no longer certain of their own victory. And in the silence, the shadows of doubt deepened into fear. The rising dread the words of the diplomat did not vanish with the ceremony. They clung to the hearts of the leaders long after the chamber had emptied. Even as they returned to their quarters, even as servants and aides tried to soothe them with songs of victory and offers of food and drink, the words stayed. Humans are the gods of war. That single phrase spread like fire through dry grass. It was whispered in private chambers, repeated in mess halls, and carried in hushed tones along the great corridors of the alien capital. No one wished to speak of it openly, yet no one could stop thinking of it either. The commanders who had fought in the longest campaigns were the first to feel the weight of the truth. They remembered the hollow victories where fleets of metal husks drifted in silence, but somehow those husks carried more terror than living ships. They remembered battles where humans turned hopeless fights into walls of fire that swallowed entire armies. They remembered the eyes of human prisoners who never begged, never pleaded, never lowered their gaze, but instead looked upon their captors as if daring them to strike. These memories, once buried under the noise of celebration, now returned in the stillness of the diplomat's words. In the following days, unease rippled through the ranks of the coalition armies. Soldiers who had once sung victory songs now spoke more quietly. Patrols along the edges of human space reported strange signals flickering in the void. Some claimed to see shadows of ships moving through the darkness, ships that bore no coalition signature yet disappeared before they could be tracked. Commanders dismissed these reports in their official records, but in private, they feared the truth. Perhaps the humans had not been destroyed. Perhaps they were watching and waiting. Whispers spread to the colonies as well. Farmers on distant Worlds said they had heard voices on old radios, faint and broken, but carrying human words. Traders swore they had seen abandoned mining stations suddenly lit again in the night. Convoys claimed to be followed by distant shapes that moved with patience rather than haste. All these reports were small and scattered, but together they wove a picture that unsettled even the most confident leaders. The humans were not gone. They were hidden, like embers glowing beneath ashes ready to spark again. The coalition leaders tried to drown this growing fear with more ceremonies. They raised new statues in the plazas, declaring the war finished. They held banquets where they spoke of a golden age of peace. Yet behind the bright music and laughter, they could see the unease in each other's eyes. Some leaders avoided speaking the human name altogether, as if silence could erase the thought of them. Others grew angry and demanded harsher measures, calling for the extermination of any surviving human, no matter how small or weak. But even those voices carried a tremor, for they knew what extermination truly meant. It meant admitting that humans were still alive. The diplomat who had spoken the truth did not return to the platform for several days. They walked the quiet streets at night, listening to the distant echoes of celebration and feeling the tension thick in the air. They saw the banners flutter in the wind above the great towers, but those banners looked less like symbols of triumph and more like fragile shields against the memory of what had been endured. The diplomat knew the coalition was already divided. Half clung to victory, desperate to believe the humans were gone. Half listened to the fear in their hearts and suspected that humanity was only biding its time. Far from the capital, among the broken edges of human space, something indeed was stirring. In the shadows of shattered planets, wreckage fields hid life. From the remains of burned colonies, survivors gathered. They carried with them the memory of every world lost and every soldier fallen. They rebuilt not with abundance but with desperation, and desperation had always been the soil where humanity grew strongest. In secret, they forged weapons from the bones of their old fleets. In silence they trained children to hold rifles and pilots to fly patched ships. Their voices did not yet rise in challenge, but their hearts carried the same fire that had burned since the first shot of war. Back in the alien capital, fear grew into argument. Some argued for crushing the humans once and for all, before they could rise again. Others argued for peace, saying that to push humanity further would only ignite another fire greater than before. The council split into factions, and meetings that had once been full of cheers now ended with silence or shouts. The unity that had won them, the war began to crack, not because of human fleets in the sky, but because of the shadow of humanity in their minds. Soldiers began to tell each other stories at night. They spoke of human ambushes where soldiers fought even without weapons, using rocks, knives, or even their bare hands. They spoke of battles where human ships rammed into cruisers 3 times their size, simply to drag the enemy down with them. Some of these stories were true, some were twisted, and some were imagined, yet all were believed. Fear gave them weight. And in fear, every human became larger than life. The diplomat knew the truth of these stories and the danger that came with them. They saw that the coalition had thought victory meant safety, yet now the coalition was more afraid than ever. It was not the presence of human armies that frightened them, but the absence of them. For absence meant the humans were preparing, and if there was one lesson the galaxy had learned, it was that prepared humans were unstoppable. As weeks passed, the diplomat returned to the council and spoke again. They told the leaders that if the coalition wished to survive, they must face the truth. Humanity had not been broken, only tempered. To press them further would not end them, but would give them reason to rise again, harder and sharper than before. The diplomat warned that silence was the most dangerous sound the humans could make, for silence was the space where their strength grew. The chamber once again fell into uneasy silence. No one cheered, no one lifted a banner. Outside the city, still celebrated, but inside the hearts of the coalition leaders, a shadow grew heavier. They had believed the war was over. Now they began to understand it had only changed shape, and so the celebration of victory turned slowly into a season of dread. Every passing day without word from humanity felt less like peace, and more like the drawing of breath before the storm. The gods of war, the capital of the coalition, no longer carried the sound of pure celebration. The songs in the streets were softer now. The banners that once seemed proud now fluttered with less meaning. Rumors had spread through every corner of the city, carried by whispers from soldier to soldier, officer to officer, and diplomat to diplomat. At first they had been dismissed as shadows, but shadows grow longer the more the light fades, and now no one could ignore them. The humans were not gone. The humans were waiting. The council was called again, and this time the chamber was heavier than before. Leaders entered with stiff movements, their eyes darting from one to another. The banners above the hall seemed more like warnings than trophies. Some spoke in anger before the meeting began, demanding that the diplomat who had filled their ears with dread be silenced. Others argued the opposite, saying the diplomat was the only one speaking truth when all others clung to lies. By the time the chamber settled, the air was so tense it felt like stone pressing down upon every chest. The diplomat rose once more. Their presence commanded silence without effort. They stood tall, their voice carrying not with fire but with an unshakable calm that forced everyone to listen. They began by telling the council that denial would not change what was real. Humanity had not been destroyed. Humanity had only stepped back. The diplomat said the coalition must look not at the silence of humans as peace, but as preparation. For silence was their most dangerous weapon. Silence was where they sharpened themselves, where they grew. The diplomat told of what they had seen in humanity during the long years of war. They described how humans had never measured their strength by weapons alone. Ships and guns could be lost, but what lived inside them could not be taken. They carried within them a will that turned suffering into power, a hunger that turned defeat into fuel, and a defiance that made even death itself feel like a smaller enemy. The diplomat said no other species in the galaxy had ever shown this. Every other race, when crushed, had broken, but humanity did not break. Humanity hardened. Council listened in silence. Some trembled as they remembered the faces of human soldiers who kept advancing, even with wounds that would have killed others. Some remembered fleets that returned to fight even when their fuel should have been gone. Some remembered colonies that rose up again and again, no matter how many times they were struck down. Each memory sharpened the diplomat's words until they cut through every heart. Then the diplomat delivered the words that would be carved into the memory of the galaxy. Forever, they said, you believe you have won, but your victory is nothing but an illusion. You have not crushed the humans, you have only taught them. And what they learn in war, they carry forever. You believe them defeated, but history will not remember today as your triumph. It will remember today as the day humanity began preparing for the next war. The chamber shook with the weight of those words. Some leaders shouted in protest, but their voices broke like glass against stone. Others lowered their heads, unable to meet the eyes of their fellow commanders. They all knew what the diplomat said was true, for the signs had been there from the beginning. Humanity had never surrendered. They had only gone silent, and silence was more terrifying than battle. The diplomat's final words came like a strike. They said, the humans are not merely soldiers. They are the gods of war, and gods do not die. They wait, they learn, and then they rise. When the diplomat stepped down from the platform, the chamber was left in complete silence. Not one cheer rose, not one song began. The council that had gathered to celebrate its triumph now sat as if they had buried themselves in fear. Outside, the citizens still danced and sang, But even there the songs were quieter, for whispers move faster than parades, and every whisper now spoke of the same truth. The humans would return far away, beyond the edges of coalition patrols. The truth of those whispers lived. In the ruins of broken colonies, fires burned at night where survivors gathered. They taught their children the names of the fallen. They told stories of battles where humans had fought to the last breath, and they swore that the blood of their dead would not be forgotten. In hidden shipyards built from wreckage, engineers welded steel and shaped weapons. In caves and ruined cities, men and women trained with rifles and blades, their voices rising in chants that carried into the night. In the shadow of shattered moons, small fleets gathered. Their ships were not polished or new, but they were alive. Each one bore scars from past battles, scars that spoke not of weakness but of endurance. Pilots strapped themselves into chairs with determination in their eyes. Soldiers marched with a rhythm that shook the ground. They were few, but every one of them carried the weight of countless dead, and in that weight lay a fire no fleet could extinguish. The humans did not sing songs of peace. They sang songs of memory, songs that spoke of the next struggle. There, silence to the galaxy was not surrender, it was focus. It was the drawing of breath before the storm. The coalition had believed silence meant defeat. In truth, silence meant preparation, and preparation meant that the gods of war were stirring. Back in the capital, the leaders of the coalition looked at each other with fear in their eyes. They knew what the diplomat's words meant. They knew that even if they built more fleets and raised more armies, none of it would erase the fact that humanity would rise again. And when they rose, they would not rise as the broken force the coalition had faced before. They would rise sharper, harder, stronger, driven by the memory of every colony burned, every family lost, every soldier fallen. The war had ended, but it was not victory. It was only a pause, a fragile pause, in the endless struggle that followed. Humanity wherever they walked. The coalition might control the skies today, but tomorrow belonged to those who had learned to turn suffering into strength. Tomorrow belonged to the humans. And so the story closed not with the ringing of victory bells, but with the quiet certainty that the galaxy had not seen the end of its fiercest enemy. For humanity was still alive, and as long as they breathed, war would never end. They had been called many names, but now one truth echoed louder than all others. Humans were the gods of war, and gods do not fall. The end.